The first time I met Aaron, he seemed almost too gentle for the world he lived in. We met at a charity gala, one of those glittering events full of people pretending to care about causes while secretly comparing diamond sizes. I was there because I worked for the nonprofit organizing it. He was there because his family name was on half the banners in the room. I remember bumping into him near the silent auction table. My hands were full of brochures, and he offered to help me without hesitation. There was a softness in his eyes, the kind that made me believe maybe kindness still existed among the rich. I was 34 at the time, a woman who had fought her way up from nothing. My mother worked as a housekeeper, and I'd spent most of my childhood watching her scrub other people's floors while promising me that one day I wouldn't have to. That promise had been the fire beneath my feet. I went to college on scholarships, worked 3 jobs, and climbed every rung of the nonprofit ladder by sheer will. But even as I sat in that ballroom wearing my best borrowed dress, I knew I didn't belong. Not really. Aaron didn't seem to notice. He laughed at my nervous jokes, asked real questions, and listened as if my words mattered. He wasn't loud or showy like the men his family raised. He was quiet, introspective, maybe even lonely. When he asked if he could see me again, I hesitated. I'd dated men like him before. They loved the idea of a self-made woman until their mothers or sisters decided she wasn't one of us. Still, something in me wanted to believe he was different. 2 weeks later, he invited me to dinner. A small, private place, he'd said his tone casual, but his eyes strangely expectant. I wore my favorite navy dress, the one that made me feel elegant without trying too hard. I still remember the soft click of my heels as I entered the restaurant, the golden lighting, the murmur of conversations blending with soft piano music. But what I didn't expect was what waited at that table, not a romantic dinner for 2, but 6 people sitting upright, eyes, sharp smiles, thin. His mother sat at the head of the table, pearls around her neck like armor. Next to her was his father, a stern man whose posture screamed authority. 2 of his sisters flanked them, both beautiful and cold, in a way that made me want to shrink. Aaron stood when he saw me, his face a mix of apology and pride. "I wanted you to meet my family," he said softly. My heart dropped. They didn't invite me to dinner. They summoned me for inspection. For the first 20 minutes, conversation danced on polite surfaces, charity events travel harmless questions about my work. But then came the shift. His mother tilted her head, eyes narrowing slightly. "So, Natalie," she said, "what does your family do?" It wasn't the question itself that hurt. It was the tone. The quiet curiosity wrapped in judgment. "My mother's retired," I said, forcing a smile. "She worked in housekeeping for many years." A silence followed, subtle but suffocating. His sister took a sip of wine, her lips twitching in amusement. "Housekeeping," she repeated, as if tasting the word for the first time. Aaron tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, but his father wasn't finished. "And your father?" "He passed when I was 10, I answered quietly. "Construction accident." The mother's hand froze over her napkin. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said flatly, but her eyes betrayed something else, something like relief, maybe even superiority. By dessert, I felt like I had been dissected. Every question was a test, every glance a verdict. They asked about my education, my salary, my apartment, my plans. And through it all, Aaron looked torn, like a man caught between love and loyalty. When the evening ended, his mother kissed my cheek and said, "You're lovely, dear. But you must understand, our family has certain traditions to uphold." Traditions. That word lodged in my throat like a thorn. In the car afterward, Aaron tried to explain. "They just want to protect me," he said, gripping the wheel too tightly. "They've seen people try to take advantage of us before." "So that's what they think I am?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer. The silence said everything. For weeks, I wrestled with my pride. Part of me wanted to walk away. But then there was another part, the one that still believed in love, that wanted to prove I wasn't the villain in their story. I told myself that time would soften them, that sincerity could melt even the coldest hearts. I was wrong. The first time I visited their family estate, I understood the kind of world I was up against. Their mansion overlooked rolling hills, guarded by iron gates taller than most trees. Inside, the air smelled of wealth-polished wood roses, something expensive I couldn't name. Aaron's mother greeted me with that same poised smile, as if she were preparing for battle under lace and pearls. They treated me with courtesy that cut like glass. Compliments laced with warning. Invitations that felt like obligations. His sisters would forget to include me in family photos or whisper about Aaron's phase. One even asked me if I felt out of place among people of our circle. Aaron defended me when he could, but his loyalty was quiet, and quiet wasn't enough. Slowly, I began to realize he wasn't just afraid of losing his family. He was afraid of standing up to them. Still, he proposed. One evening, under a canopy of fairy lights in his backyard, he knelt and told me he loved me. I said yes because my heart still believed in happy endings, even when logic begged me not to. The engagement set off a storm. His mother called me privately the next day. "Natalie," she said, her tone icy but composed. "I admire your ambition, but be reasonable. Marrying Aaron would destroy the balance of our family. You'll never be accepted." I hung up before she could finish. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just sat there in silence, staring at the ring that suddenly felt too heavy for my hand. 2 days later, I received a message from an unknown number, a photo of Aaron having dinner with another woman. My heart stopped. The caption read, "He's already moved on. Maybe you should too." At first, I didn't believe it. I thought it was another one of their manipulative tricks. But when Aaron didn't answer my calls for 2 days, I drove to his place. His car wasn't there. His phone went to voicemail. My chest ached, but somewhere deep down, I already knew. When he finally called me, his voice was cold. "My family's right," he said. "This isn't going to work." He didn't even have the courage to see me in person. The weeks that followed felt like walking through fog. I went to work, smiled for meetings, but every night I came home and collapsed into silence. My mother would call and ask if I was eating. I'd tell her yes, but I wasn't. I'd stare at my reflection and wonder what I'd done wrong, why love always seemed to choose someone else. Months later, I heard he was engaged again to the daughter of a wealthy business partner. The wedding was the talk of the city. Photos filled social media, every smile brighter than the last. People said they were the perfect match. I stayed offline for days. Then came the twist I never saw coming. A week before his wedding, Aaron showed up at my office. He looked exhausted, haunted almost. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice trembling. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but I can't stop thinking about you." For a moment, I felt that old ache stir again, that dangerous hope. But I wasn't the same woman he'd left behind. "Your mistake," I said quietly, "wasn't choosing her. It was letting them choose for you." He tried to reach for my hand, but I stepped back. "You should go," I whispered. He looked at me like a man realizing too late what love costs when pride gets in the way. He left that day, and I thought that was the end of it. But fate wasn't finished. 2 months later, headlines broke. Morrison Industries faces fraud investigation. Aaron's father and brother-in-law were accused of embezzling millions in charity funds, including from the very foundation where I worked. The same one where Aaron and I had first met. My phone didn't stop ringing. Reporters wanted statements. Donors demanded answers. And as the truth unfolded, it became clear that his family had been laundering donations through fake accounts, money meant for orphanage programs and disaster relief. I was sick to my stomach. Those funds could have changed lives. Children had gone hungry because of their greed. But there was something they didn't know. I had kept records, emails, payment receipts, and internal communications that hinted at discrepancies long before the investigation began. Back then, I hadn't dared speak up, afraid of losing my job, afraid of them. Now, I wasn't afraid anymore. I gathered every piece of evidence and handed it over to federal investigators. My hands trembled as I did it, not from fear, but from the weight of everything that had led me here. The dinner, the humiliation, the heartbreak. Weeks later, the news aired footage of the Morrisons being escorted out of their mansion in handcuffs. Aaron wasn't among them, but his mother's face, once so composed, now looked hollow. I thought I'd feel triumphant. Instead, I just felt still. Because revenge, when it finally arrives, doesn't feel like victory. It feels like closure. That night, I sat on my porch sipping tea, staring at the city lights. I remembered that first dinner, their eyes judging their smiles, pretending. And I whispered to myself, "You wanted to judge me. Well, life judged you back." But even as I said it, part of me mourned. For the man I once loved. For the girl I used to be. For all the pain that could have been avoided if love had been braver. Months passed after the Morrisons' downfall, and the city's elite whispered their name like a ghost story. Their empire crumbled fast, properties seized accounts, frozen reputations shredded across newspapers and TV screens. I didn't celebrate. I just went on with my work, quietly rebuilding the pieces of myself that had been shattered long before their world fell apart. People congratulated me for doing the right thing, but they didn't see the nights I lay awake wondering if I'd gone too far. I hadn't set out for revenge, at least not at first. But somewhere between heartbreak and justice, the lines had blurred. The truth had become my weapon, and once it was unleashed, there was no stopping it. Then one evening, I received a message from an unknown number. "Can we talk? It's about Aaron." For a long time, I stared at the screen. My first instinct was to ignore it, but something inside me, curiosity, compassion, I'm not sure, made me reply. We agreed to meet at a small cafe downtown, one far removed from the world of glass towers and limousines. When I walked in, I saw him sitting near the window. He looked older, thinner, his once perfect posture slumped. The light from outside fell across his face, revealing eyes heavy with regret. "Thank you for coming," he said softly. "I almost didn't," I admitted, sitting down. He nodded. "I wouldn't have blamed you." We sat in silence for a moment, the clatter of cups and low music filling the space between us. Then he spoke. "They lost everything," he said quietly. "My mother's been ill. My father's under house arrest. I'm trying to hold what's left together." I wanted to feel pity. I really did. But all I could think about was that night at the restaurant, the way they'd looked at me like I was something to be examined and dismissed. "I didn't know about the fraud," he continued. "Not until the investigation started. But maybe that's worse, isn't it? Pretending not to see what's right in front of you." I looked at him for a long time. "You didn't pretend," I said quietly. "You just chose not to fight." He lowered his gaze. "I was a coward." He was right. And yet seeing him like that, stripped of the arrogance, the family's money, the protection of his name, I couldn't hate him anymore. I realized I'd already moved past hate. We talked for hours. He told me he was working again, starting over in a small consulting firm, trying to rebuild without the Morrison fortune. There was humility in his voice, the kind that only comes from loss. Before we parted, he looked at me and said, "You saved a lot of lives, Natalie. What you did, it mattered." For a second, I felt tears rise behind my eyes, but I blinked them away. "I didn't do it for them," I said. I did it for the truth. He nodded, then smiled faintly, a sad, grateful smile, and walked away into the evening. I thought that would be the last time I ever saw him. But fate, as always, had other plans. A few weeks later, I received a call from a journalist who was covering a follow-up on the Morrison scandal. "Ms. Hale," she said, "I was wondering if you'd like to comment on Aaron Morrison's foundation. It seems he started a new charity, one focused on rebuilding the very programs his family's company defrauded." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just listened as she explained how he'd used his personal funds to repay what was stolen anonymously, quietly. No press conferences, no grand gestures, just quiet restitution. I hung up and sat there for a long time, staring at my reflection in the window. The woman looking back at me wasn't the same one who had walked into that dinner months ago, trembling under judgment. I'd changed. Hardened, perhaps, but also awakened. Still, part of me wondered if forgiveness was ever possible after betrayal that deep. That question haunted me one evening when I visited my mother. She lived in a modest apartment filled with warmth and the smell of jasmine tea. She listened as I told her everything: the dinner, the humiliation, the downfall, the aftermath. When I finished, she just looked at me for a long time. "Do you remember what I used to tell you when you were little?" she asked. I shook my head. "Revenge might feed your anger," she said softly, "but forgiveness feeds your soul. The question is, which one do you want to keep alive?" Her words stayed with me for days. I wasn't ready to forgive, not yet. But for the first time, I wanted to. So when Aaron reached out again this time to invite me to the opening of his new foundation, I said yes. The event was small, intimate. Nothing like the galas his family used to host. Children from local shelters attended, along with community leaders and volunteers. The air was filled with something I hadn't felt in a long time: sincerity. When he saw me, he smiled. "You came." "I wanted to see it for myself," I said. He nodded. "It's not redemption," he said quietly, "but it's a start." I looked around at the children laughing, the walls lined with photos of rebuilding projects. For the first time, I saw not the heir to a corrupt empire, but a man who was finally standing on his own. Maybe that was his karma, not punishment, but awakening. After the ceremony, he walked me to my car. The evening breeze carried the faint scent of rain and lilacs. I never got to say, "I'm sorry," he said. "Not for what my family did. For what I did. For not protecting you when you needed me to." I looked at him, and for the first time, I saw not the man who broke me, but the one who made me stronger. "I forgive you," I whispered. The words came out trembling, but once they were free, I felt lighter. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about freeing myself from the weight of resentment. He closed his eyes, relief flooding his face. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That means more than you know." That night, I went home and stood by my window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. I thought about all the people who had tried to define me by my past, my class, my worth. And I smiled because I finally understood something. The people who judge you only expose the limits of their own souls. Weeks turned into months. Life moved forward. I poured myself back into my work, into rebuilding trust where corruption had once festered. And sometimes when I saw news of Aaron's projects, I felt a strange mix of pride and peace. But one day, a letter arrived. No return address, just my name written in his handwriting. Inside was a simple note. "You taught me that love without courage is just comfort. I'm trying to be courageous now. Wherever life takes you, I hope it brings you joy." I pressed the paper to my chest and closed my eyes. There was no longing, no regret, just quiet gratitude. because in a way, his family had judged me once to measure my worth. But life had judged them all and taught each of us what truly mattered. Years later, I visited my mother's grave. I told her everything, how the pain had turned into peace, how forgiveness had become my greatest rebellion. And as I stood there, the wind brushed against my cheek like her hand once did, and I whispered, "You were right, Mom. Forgiveness feeds the soul." But even as the tears came, I smiled, because this wasn't the end of my story, it was the beginning of a new one. A year later, the Morrison name had faded from the headlines, replaced by newer scandals, fresher tragedies, louder chaos. But for me, the echoes of that story still lived quietly in the background of my life, like an old scar healed, yet never invisible. My career changed after everything. The foundation I worked for rebuilt its credibility, and somehow people began to see me as a symbol of integrity, of resilience. It was strange. They called me brave, but I never felt brave. I just did what I had to do to survive. The truth was, I had been terrified the whole time, terrified of losing my job, of being dragged through the mud, of being called vindictive. But I also knew that silence would have cost me my soul. Sometimes I gave guest talks at smaller nonprofit events, mostly to young women who wanted to make a difference in the world. They'd ask about courage, about justice, about how to fight powerful people without losing yourself. I always told them the same thing: power doesn't scare me anymore. What scares me is forgetting who I am. It wasn't until one of those talks that I realized Aaron was in the audience. I froze for a moment, my voice catching mid-sentence. He stood in the back wearing a simple navy suit, no entourage, no arrogance. Just him. When the session ended, he waited until everyone had left before approaching me. "You were incredible," he said softly. "Thank you," I replied. My tone was calm, but my heart was anything but. "I didn't want to intrude," he continued. "I just wanted to see you speak, to see who you've become." I smiled faintly. "You mean who I always was? You just couldn't see it back then." He nodded, accepting the truth like a man who had learned how to live with his mistakes. "You're right. I didn't see it. I was blind to everything that mattered." There was no bitterness in my voice anymore, only understanding. Sometimes we have to lose everything to understand what's worth keeping. He looked at me for a long moment, then said something that I wasn't prepared for. "Do you ever think about what could have been?" It was an honest question, and for the first time, I gave an honest answer. Sometimes. But then I remember how much I had to lose to become who I am, and I wouldn't trade that for anything, not even us. He didn't argue. He just smiled, a quiet, almost proud smile. "You're stronger than anyone I know." Maybe I said softly, "But strength comes at a cost." He sighed. "I hope one day that cost feels worth it." He left before I could reply, and I watched him disappear through the double doors. That was the last time I saw him in person. Life, as it tends to do, kept moving. Seasons shifted, people changed, and my world slowly found balance again. I poured myself into projects that mattered: education for underprivileged girls, rebuilding homes, after disasters, providing scholarships for children of single mothers. I wanted to create the kind of opportunities my mother never had. Then, one day, I received an invitation. A handwritten letter this time, elegant but simple. It was from Aaron's foundation. He was being honored for his humanitarian work, and they were dedicating a new youth center in his name. At the bottom, in his familiar handwriting, was a note. "I'd like you to see what you inspired." I almost didn't go, but something told me I needed to. Not for him, for me. When I arrived, the event was held at a small community center. It wasn't extravagant. There were no chandeliers, no champagne, just people, kids, laughing parents, smiling volunteers working. The walls were lined with art from children who'd been given a second chance. It felt pure. When they unveiled the plaque, I felt my throat tighten. It read, "Dedicated to those who were once judged and still chose compassion." Tears stung my eyes before I could stop them. It wasn't about me directly, but I knew. I knew that line was born from our story, from that painful dinner, from everything that followed. After the ceremony, one of the volunteers approached me. She was maybe 22 with hopeful eyes that reminded me of my younger self. "Are you Miss Hale?" she asked shyly. "Yes," I said. "I just wanted to thank you," she continued. "The scholarship I received your foundation partnered with Aaron's. It changed my life." Her words hit harder than any headline ever could. "You earned it," I told her softly. "Never let anyone tell you that where you come from defines where you're going." That night, as I drove home, the city lights blurred against my windshield. I thought about how everything had come full circle. How pain, when faced with honesty, could transform into something good. But fate, it seemed, had one more twist left. A few months later, I got a call from one of Aaron's board members. Their tone was gentle, but heavy. "Natalie, they said I thought you should know. Aaron passed away last night. Heart complications. It was sudden." I froze. The room around me went still, as if the world had stopped breathing for a moment. When I hung up, I sat there in silence, the memories flooding back: the first dinner, the heartbreak, the forgiveness, the redemption. And I cried. Not for the man he once was, but for the man he had become. At his memorial, I stood among strangers who all spoke about his kindness, his humility, his transformation. He had spent his final years quietly making amends, dedicating his wealth to rebuilding what his family once destroyed. He had turned guilt into grace. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't prepare a speech. I just walked to the front, my voice trembling, but steady. "I met Aaron Morrison years ago," I began, "and for a time, I thought he broke me. But looking back now, I realize he taught me what real courage is: not the kind that fights to win, but the kind that stands alone when it matters most. He showed me that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about choosing every day to be better than the person you were before." As I stepped down, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders, the last remnants of anger, grief, and what-ifs. It was over. Later that evening, after everyone had gone, I walked through the garden outside the church. The sun had set, and a soft orange glow lingered on the horizon. I closed my eyes, breathing in the quiet air, and for a moment, I could almost hear his voice again. Not the proud air I once knew, but the man who finally learned to listen. I whispered into the fading light. "You were judged too, Aaron, but you found your peace. Maybe that's the real ending we both needed." I stood there until the stars began to appear. The pain didn't vanish, but it softened like a scar finally healing. Because in the end, love and revenge had danced their tragic dance, but forgiveness had written the final line. The years that followed felt strangely quiet, like the world had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. I moved to a small coastal town in Maine, away from the noise of the city, away from the ghosts of the life I'd once lived. My days became simpler. Mornings spent walking along the foggy shore with a cup of coffee in hand, afternoons working remotely with a small humanitarian organization that didn't care about headlines or donors' last names. Sometimes I'd see couples holding hands along the boardwalk, or children running with ice cream cones melting down their wrists, and I'd feel that familiar ache, not of regret, but of remembrance. The kind that reminds you that you've lived, that you've loved, that you've lost, and somehow survived it all. There were days when I'd still think of Aaron, not constantly, but in small, unexpected ways. A certain melody on the radio, the smell of rain after a long, dry spell, the way sunlight glinted off the waves, the same way it had once caught in his eyes when he laughed. Those memories didn't hurt anymore. They just existed like faded pages in a book I no longer needed to reread, but could never quite throw away. One afternoon, as I was sorting through old boxes, I found that letter he'd written me, the one he sent before he passed. The paper was yellowed at the edges, his handwriting steady, deliberate. You taught me that love without courage is just comfort. I traced the words with my fingertips and smiled sadly. Because that was true, and it had taken both of us years' mistakes and heartbreak to learn it. I slipped the letter back into its envelope and tucked it inside a drawer with a quiet sense of finality. Not an ending, just peace. A few weeks later, I was invited to a local college to give a talk on ethics in charity work. The audience was young, vibrant, idealistic. As I stood there sharing my story, not of revenge or downfall, but of truth, courage, and grace, I noticed a young woman in the front row staring at me with tears in her eyes. Afterward, she came up to me. "Ms. Hale," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I read about what you did years ago, about exposing corruption, standing up to power. My mom used to work for Morrison Industries. She lost her job when the company fell apart, but she said it was the best thing that ever happened to her. She started her own cleaning business, and now she employs 30 women. You gave her that freedom." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I smiled, trying not to cry. "No," I said softly. "Your mother gave herself that freedom. I just helped open the door." As she hugged me, I realized something I hadn't before, that the ripple of our choices reaches farther than we can ever see. My pain, my defiance, my decision to tell the truth, they had become part of something bigger. Later that evening, I walked along the beach near my cottage. The sky was a watercolor of oranges and pinks, and the sea stretched endlessly ahead. The air smelled of salt and possibility. I thought about my mother, about her quiet strength, her dignity, her words about forgiveness feeding the soul. I whispered a thank you to her, to Aaron, to every version of myself that had once felt lost. There was a small bench by the dunes where I often sat at sunset. I closed my eyes and let the wind brush against my face. For the first time in so long, I felt utterly content. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was the life I'd earned. One built not on wealth, approval, or revenge, but on truth, healing, and forgiveness. I used to believe that being judged was the worst thing that could happen to me. That night at the dinner table, surrounded by eyes that measured my worth against their world, I'd felt like I was shrinking. But now, I understood something deeper, that their judgment had nothing to do with me. It had everything to do with the walls they'd built around themselves. And when those walls finally crumbled, I didn't need to stand over the rubble and gloat, because I had already walked away long before it fell. Every scar on my heart had taught me something. The humiliation had taught me humility. The betrayal had taught me boundaries. The pain had taught me strength, and forgiveness that had taught me peace. I think we all go through a moment in life when we're invited to that metaphorical dinner, when people sit across from us smiling politely while deciding whether we're enough. It could be a family, a workplace, a relationship. And when that moment comes, the most important thing isn't whether they approve of us. It's whether we recognize our own worth, even if no one else at the table does. That night in the restaurant, years ago, I didn't know it yet. But walking into that room wasn't my test, it was theirs. And when life eventually passed its judgment, I didn't need revenge. Karma had already done the work for me. As the sun disappeared beneath the horizon, I whispered into the sea breeze, "I forgive you all, and I forgive myself." Because that's what freedom sounds like, quiet, gentle, and final. I stood up, brushing sand from my coat, and began the walk back home. The tide was coming in, and I could hear the rhythmic hush of the waves behind me, steady as a heartbeat. I knew there would still be lonely days, still memories that tugged unexpectedly at my chest. But they didn't scare me anymore. They were proof of a life fully lived, one where love, betrayal, truth, and redemption had all taken turns shaping who I was. Before I reached my porch, I turned back one last time. The ocean shimmered beneath the last light of dusk, endless and calm. I thought of Erin, of my mother, of that girl in the front row, of every person who had judged me or stood by me. And I felt gratitude, not for what they did, but for what I learned. Because sometimes the people who try to break you are the very ones who push you into your becoming. If you've ever been judged, dismissed, or made to feel small, I hope my story reminds you that your worth isn't something anyone else gets to measure. You define it every single day by how you rise after the fall. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope tonight. Leave a comment to tell me your thoughts, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true stories like this one. Because maybe, just maybe, the stories we share can remind someone out there that forgiveness isn't weakness, it's freedom.